So, so this rise of industry, industrialization, is sort of the topic. Post Civil War, right? At the time of the Civil War, the nation looks one way. Within a generation, the nation is going to look quite different. And I think those that lived through it kind of experienced that in some challenging ways. Maybe that helps explain a lot of the turmoil of the period, in that people feel like their world is changing around them even while they're sort of living through it, right? So at the time of the Civil War, for example, um, the normal U.S. kind of business or firm was a small, maybe family-owned business, right? This was sort of the norm. Um, they might produce goods for local consumption. They might produce goods and trade with their neighbors, trade locally, um, or even for a regional market. But they're not really thinking nationally. They're not. Most of them are not thinking globally at this moment. Um, but the idea of the businessman is going to change in this period, right? The sort of captain of industry model that takes hold really, I think, changes identities in many ways. People producing on a large scale, people investing on a large scale, and sometimes investing everything and winning and losing everything overnight. Right? Leading the charge in this period are some figures that we've become very familiar with, and that we're still familiar with. These sort of captains of industry slash robber barons. I want you to think of those two terms together because both terms are used to describe some of the prominent individuals of this period. And there's still debate over whether these folks should be considered captains of industry, which is a kind of very positive term, right? That they're sort of sailing American business into the modern era, right? This idea of progress. So are they captains of industry in that sense, or are they robber barons? Are they folks that basically are holding the American economy and its people hostage, that are taking advantage of maybe rules that are not in place yet? Are they kind of parasites? Right? Are they sort of feeding off the blood of common people? Right? These are a lot of the arguments that are going to be made at the time, and I think people are still trying to consider what this means. Are they captains of industry, or are they robber barons? So men like Andrew Carnegie in the steel industry, Philip Armour, Jay Gould, Rockefeller, Henry Ford, right? Folks that we still know, names that we still know. In one sense, that tells you how prominent they are, the fact that we still know their names 150 years later. One of the things they do is they lead this rise of industry that occurs at an unparalleled pace. The economy is growing at an unparalleled and even unimaginable pace in this period. For example, in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, annual production of goods was estimated at about $2 billion. $2 billion in 1865, the annual production of goods. 35 years later, a generation basically, in 1900, that same statistic would be 13 billion. So from 2 billion to 13 billion in 35 years. This is not just a doubling, this is, the math majors can sort of figure out, a little over 600%, I guess. This transforms the U.S. from fourth to first in the world in productivity. From fourth to first in the world in productivity in one generation, in a 30-year period. So economically, this is a key tipping point. By the early 20th century, American industry would make 1/3 of the entire world's goods. 1/3 of the world's goods, right? We're producing not just enough for domestic consumption, but for the world. And ultimately, that becomes important too if you think about having markets, right? Having trading partners, maybe even overproducing. One of the causes of the Great Depression is going to be overproduction. What happens when you produce too much? That people can't buy it, can't consume it, and then the price goes down. Again, you econ majors know all about supply and demand. If you flood the market, it can be a bad thing. But in this period, it's unparalleled growth. Right? This growth is going to lead to a number of social changes. It's not just about dollars and cents. It's sometimes about how it impacts society, the kind of psychology of this, how folks are going to experience their world. Consumer changes, things like the growth of advertising that we're going to see explode. For example, department stores, some of whose names we still know, like Marshall Field, Filene's, right, Macy's. The growth of these types of stores and the way people can buy things is changing in this period. Also, I think we could relate these department stores to a concept of imagined community. Everybody buying, say, from a Macy's catalog anywhere in the country. You could be wearing the same thing in California that you're wearing in New York, rather than just sort of homemade clothing that might be very individualistic in that sense. So this is almost creating national community in a way that it may not have existed before. It's creating a kind of consumer culture that we're very familiar with now. Businesses also would seek greater control and greater power, not just money in the final instance, but power and control, which translates to sort of security. That can also translate back to money and profits, but it's about security and control. So, for example, a number of businesses want to control as many aspects of business as possible to try to ensure their profits at the moment and in the future. So, for example, they might want to not only control the source of raw materials, the things they use to make their products, right? But they also want to control production, the way that they make things, the markets, who they sell to, right? To have a kind of captive market. If you know you have 1 million customers every year and nobody else has access to them, you can control a number of things in terms of profits. This is not always possible, however. We've seen the economic setbacks, for example, in the 1870s, 1873, 1893. Right? There are two major economic downturns that challenge a number of people. But in some ways, this might even help the sort of captains of industry or robber barons, because what these economic depressions do is they eliminate competition. I'd say there were 100 people involved in railroads. All of a sudden, 95 of them are out of business. Right? Then there's 5 left, and there's 2 big ones. Right? If you can just put those other 4 out of business, you control the entire industry. And we're going to see a lot of this happening in this period where the economy and its uncertainty would eliminate competition and lead to a kind of streamlining in some ways. Now, again, is that a bad thing or a good thing? People have thought about this differently over time. Is it bad or good if businesses go out of business? Well, if you're in business, you want to dominate your competition, right? It helps you. Yet, if you're the only business left standing, you can charge whatever you want. If iPhone puts, Samsung and Android out of business, they can charge $8 million for an iPhone if you want one. If it's the only game in town, you can do what you want to do. And does that ultimately help or hurt the consumer? That's going to be an issue. But it's a complicated issue, especially in a system of capitalism where it's about competition, it's about profit. And in a democratic system that sort of prides itself on the government staying out of the economy to a large degree, kind of letting the economy sort things out. These are fine lines that Americans are sort of navigating in this period. Businesses would grow in 2 distinct ways. I want to talk about these terms: vertical integration, horizontal combination. Vertical integration and horizontal combination, what those mean. Businesses are going to grow in 2 ways. They're going to seek control in a couple of different ways. Number 1, vertical integration. Vertical integration refers to gaining control of production at every step. Gaining control of production at every step. From raw materials, controlling the raw materials, through processing, and through transportation of the produced finished goods. So you control every step from the raw material to production to the end game. A company that was an example of this would be United Fruit Company. United Fruit controls the farms. They control production, transportation, and sale. And this gives them tremendous power, tremendous flexibility. Not only economic power, but political power in many ways. A lot of companies, for example, like the United Fruit, may have a say in the conquest of Hawaii. One of their products being pineapple, for example. So economics and politics can come together in some interesting ways in this period once you gain this tremendous amount of power. So vertical integration, again, gaining control of production at every step, from raw materials through processing and transportation of finished goods. So think vertical, right, up and down. Raw materials down here, end game here. You control every aspect of it. Think about a number of companies that might try to do that. Horizontal combination, so think horizon. Horizontal combination is a different type of growth. Horizontal combination involved gaining control of the market for a single product. So gaining complete control of the market for one single product. For example, a standard oil company. They become so dominant they're able to put everybody out of business, so they're the only game in town. They can achieve horizontal combination. So anybody that wants oil has to go see Standard Oil and deal with them. So some are going to seek vertical integration, some are going to seek horizontal combination, and it's going to give them tremendous power in this period. Again, people are deciding, is this a good or a bad thing? Is this a good or a bad thing? Many are influenced by a lot of the larger ideas of the time. Think social Darwinism, for example, right? Which is one of their presentation ideas. What is social Darwinism? Just real quick on that. What do you know about that term? Was that your presentation? Social Darwinism? But and anybody can sort of fill this in. How would you define social Darwinism?
It was like this ideological movement that kind of piggybacked off a lot of Darwinistic views, and it was prominent in industry and race relations, class inequality, and it was this idea that the government shouldn't interfere with established, the establishment of industry and social dynamics, because that would be seen as unnatural, it would be seen as going against nature, because they're in place because nature favored them as strong. So
good, yeah, good. And you sort of already get a sense of the power of this idea and how many different areas of life it might impact. You mentioned class relations, race relations, gender relations may come into this as well. Businesses putting each other out of business, right, is seen as natural, normal, and to interfere with that is actually seen as unnatural. Right? The government shouldn't be involving itself in these things, that it's not only unnecessary, but actually a bad thing, right? Because sort of nature has set it up so that the weaker ones will naturally die out. Right? So if you save them, you're actually doing a disservice, both to them and to the other businesses in some ways. This is going to be used, social Darwinism would impact a number of different things in this time period, from ideas about imperialism, that certain nations should perhaps dominate others, for class relations, and some of these labor struggles are going to be impacted tremendously by this. The business world, whether it seems like a waste of time then to intervene, say, on behalf of the poor. Right? The folks use social Darwinism in this period to say, you know what, the poor are going to die out anyway. There's nothing you can even really do. So why worry about their starvation or their difficulties? You're doing them a disservice, and you're doing the larger country a disservice. Again, it comes out of, like I said, Charles Darwin's work with animals. He did not intend this really to apply to human beings, but a number of folks take those ideas from the animal world and plant world and such and apply it to human society, both in terms of individuals, right? So say even an idea like racism has its sort of basis in a kind of social Darwinism in some ways, that there are certain racial groups that are more fit, and that those groups will survive no matter what, and that they should survive. And these others are sort of bound to die out. In terms of nations, there are certain nations that are more fit. So this idea is really, really significant in this period, in the way that it's applied, the way that it can be applied. Imagine if you're a captain of industry, a robber baron at this point, you would consider yourself one of the fit. Right? You've won, you've outcompeted your competitors, so you've sort of demonstrated your fitness in a sense. You shouldn't feel bad for them from that perspective. Right? You also shouldn't necessarily feel bad for your workers. Again, others may be going to challenge these ideas and go different directions, but it's a very sort of powerful idea. And I would say some of it stays with us to this day, at least. A lot of it may stay with us to this day. Others may challenge it, say, from a religious perspective, that universal brotherhood and these sorts of things. But it's a very powerful kind of motivating factor. I think you see it, especially how it might impact the business world in this moment. Good. Government has to decide how it's going to react to this. Government has to decide how much it may want to regulate or not regulate business. The tide may start to turn in one direction or another. Maybe better yet, the pendulum may swing in different directions around this. So, for example, in 1890, Congress would pass the Sherman Antitrust Act. Sherman Antitrust Act, in particularly responding to these businesses that are able to put out their competition and become larger and larger businesses, trusts, corporations or trusts. Again, is that a good thing or bad thing? It's something that's being debated. The Sherman Antitrust Act would be passed in 1890 to try to restore competition. Try to restore competition by encouraging small businesses and outlawing, quote unquote, every combination in restraint of trade or commerce. Outlawing every combination in restraint of trade or commerce. So again, if you're a believer in capitalism, one of the ideas you may hold is that capitalism is actually good for the consumer because competition not only weeds out the weaker businesses, but it provides alternatives. It provides incentive to produce things more cheaply, to therefore put out your, to win business-wise. But producing things more cheaply means you can sell them cheaper, that you can produce better products. So ultimately, that may help the consumer as well. So this is also the motivating factor in some ways behind, say, a Sherman Antitrust Act, that you shouldn't allow anyone to dominate or form a monopoly. Some of the language we'll start to see in this period, that actually hurts the country. However, this law passes, but it would be interpreted initially in ways not that impacted really the sort of robber barons or captains of industry at first, but they're really going to use it against unions. So this idea of workers coming together is seen as a combination, interesting enough. Again, it's intended perhaps one way, but it's going to be used early on against labor and trade unions. More than 2,600 firms would vanish in 4 years between 1898 and 1902. More than 2,600 firms would vanish, essentially go out of business, as you see more and more and larger combinations of various types. So again, there's a lot of things happening. Think about how the ideas are motivating people's actions, but also maybe justifying their actions in some ways. Social Darwinism, though, is not the only idea out there. The gospel of wealth is another one, largely identified with people like Andrew Carnegie. This gospel of wealth could also be just as important a motivator. I forget what number that was. Group 1. What is the gospel of wealth? What might you say about that, you guys in group 1? How would we define it, at least, as a starting point?
Well, that was an article he wrote in the National American Review.
Yeah.
He just basically said that really wealthy people should invest in like the communities and build finance public institutions like libraries, parks, schools, stuff like that.
Okay.
My take from it was the sort of title like the social Darwinism thing is. He didn't really say like poor people were bad, but he said like rich people. There's just something like important about that status, and like just because they have the money and resources to like build things, there's they serve a big purpose in society.
Okay, they have a certain purpose and almost responsibility. Right? It's interesting. You could argue, first of all, you could argue that these two ideas are, in direct opposition to one another. The idea of social Darwinism and an idea of the sort of gospel of wealth, in a sense. But it's about responsibility on some level. Right? If you're wealthy, do you have a responsibility just to yourself? Right? That you essentially are. Are sort of fulfilling what's natural and what should be, the way that it's written, or like a Carnegie, especially near the end of his life, is going to say you have a certain responsibility to make the world a better place. Right? What are you going to do with all this money? You can't take it with you, kind of thing. Carnegie has some of these moments, especially later in life. If you haven't spent any time in Pennsylvania, know about Carnegie Library System and other things he would donate, millions of dollars to. In fact, because, sort of understanding that, okay, I've made this money, but I have a certain larger social responsibility. A social Darwinist perspective said, no, you don't. Right? They can do it just as well as you can do it. Why do you have a responsibility to help them? In some ways, it's really interesting how these two concepts emerge and really emerge in contrast to one another. It is, like you said, definitely identified with Carnegie. He writes this article in 1889 or something like that about this this phenomenon. You can kind of see the role of religion in some ways playing into this as well. Perhaps that influences someone like a Carnegie. This larger gospel of wealth idea itself is, I think, maybe in many ways just as powerful. Think even today. Think about some of the wealthier figures today, like a Bill Gates. He definitely is impacted by something like this, that he has now more money than he could possibly ever spend. Right? Makes more in interest than most nations are going to make all year. And so he's going to put all this money into education and clean water and all these other things, right, that you have perhaps a certain responsibility in that sense. Very significant belief systems or worldviews, and they arise in this period. So in terms of the gospel of wealth, give you some ideas to think about. 90% of the nation's business leaders in this period consider themselves Protestant, consider themselves religious people. So maybe it's no coincidence then that religion might find some way into their public worldviews. The majority of them would attend church regularly, in fact. Right? We kind of imagine these guys as these old hermits that don't go out into the real world and are evil people in that way. And that's kind of the Robert Barron interpretation in some ways. But that obviously is probably extreme. Now, there's going to be some things that some of these figures do that might lend to that interpretation, but many of them are consider themselves sort of normal people or blessed in a certain way, as opposed to being sort of deserving everything that they have gotten. Many attributed their personal achievement to hard work, right? This idea, this very American dream kind of thing, right? Hard work pays off. Perseverance is one of the characteristics how they would describe themselves. And many would almost look at business or wealth as a kind of secularized religion. That they really believe in what they're doing, and that the fact that they have done so well shows that God wanted them to succeed. Right? So again, they could take the religion and not necessarily take the religion out of the business part of this. There's a faith in business. I would say that the gospel of wealth might be one version of this. It might be one version. Now, some folks are going to say that the fact that they are successful, the fact that they have become so wealthy, shows that God was on their side, that they were kind of the chosen few in that sense, and that it even might justify ruthless behavior. It was good that they put 100 businesses out of business. It can be interpreted in a number of different ways. Even if it involves shady business dealings, right? Do the ends justify the means? Right? These are some of the questions that are being raised. A Jay Gould and Railroads, for example, might fit this, right? There are stories, and if you've seen the Men Who Built America series at all, you kind of see the back and forth between some of these guys. I mean, some of them were rough figures, a rough bunch. Vanderbilt, former boxer and such. I mean, he was not, quote unquote, a nice guy in some ways, but very ruthless and very rugged, but believed in what he was doing and believed it was very American. Carnegie, again, is perhaps a slightly different model in some ways, depending on who you ask about him. He's called the richest man in the world, bless you, at one point. He's the richest man in the world, and he thought he's going to offer a different model, that he could be a captain of industry, that he might lead the nation and the world in a better direction. Carnegie rises up the ranks. He's a recent immigrant himself, comes with nothing, and sort of, this very American story of pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps. So maybe his perspective is different than someone that had inherited millions of dollars, right? He's sort of self-made in that sense. His book, Gospel of Wealth, would appear in 1889. Carnegie built up his steel empire, and by 1900, he managed the most efficient steel mills in the world, accounting for 1/3 of the nation's output. So he definitely self-made. When he sells out to J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel Company and sort of retires, his personal share comes on. So I've seen numbers from $225 million to $400 million. That's around 1901. So in today's dollars, that would be much, much more. he actually, he's playing golf, and this sort of story about him selling out. He's asked, how much would it cost you to buy you out? He comes up with this ridiculous number that he thinks Morgan can, no one could possibly afford. So he writes the number on a piece of paper and gives it to them. And he's surprised when they say, okay. It was so just out of the norm, and so he is out at this point. Whether overly harsh, like a Jay Gould, or less so, like a Carnegie, these huge concentrations of wealth are at least partially justified by ideas of social Darwinism, yet many would understand that other ideas would be just as significant as well. Darwinism actually, Charles Darwin's writing in the late 1850s, and so his ideas really pick up during the Civil War and afterwards. But again, social Darwinism really picks up in the 1890s, and it's more about the application of what Darwin meant for science and the animal kingdom, and evolution and such, to people. Some say, though, and I would say that it fits very much into this notion of the American dream, that hard work pays off. If you don't work hard, then you won't be rewarded. So again, put that in reverse. So if you're not being rewarded, say you're poor or you're oppressed in some way, maybe you deserve it. Maybe you deserve it. This is going to be at least a part of the way folks would think. And it's going to, I think, impact the captains of industry and unions and other aspects of American life in this period. There's also a sort of associated gospel of work. Gospel of work. Yeah. This idea that work itself is good, right? Got a Puritan work ethic, right? Work hard, God will reward you, and also you'll get paid. Right? It's sort of a two-pronged kind of argument. Work hard, you'll make money, but also work hard, and this is actually pleasing to God. That goes back at least to the Puritans. Right? Read verses like idle hands or the devil's playbook or what it is. So this idea of being busy, that work is not just important just for the paycheck, but that it's important in a larger sense as well. There's a dignity in this hard work. How does this impact, though, the labor movement? I'm going to talk much more about the labor movement next time. Initially, the labor movement would remain small in size. It's less than 3% unionized in the early 1890s. But it's going to be a significant response if we think about it. It's common people, it's workers, people that are normally seen as powerless, forming imagined community, coming together. And ultimately, they're going to be able to exercise power, even sometimes power at the expense of some of these captains of industry, bringing them in conflict with some of these captains of industry. Technology is going to change the relationship between employees and employers as well. Technology is always improving. It's going to change this relationship in some important ways. We could talk more about kind of labor in the age of big business and unions and such, I think, a little bit later on. Because I think what I want to do now is pause there